objectives, what we want to do here with the 3 types of data review rhythms, we're going to focus on, once we've got the OKRs, the weekly and monthly scorecards in place, we want to then move into what's the weekly pulse look like? What does the monthly metric review look like? And what is the quarterly OKR retrospective? So a little bit of twist here. As Joe said, we're not, you don't need to be limited to starting some of these rhythms until you finish the OKRs. We are going to pick that up after our November meeting and focus on driving that forward so you do have great objectives and key results. But ideally how this works is once you have all of these pieces put together, good OKRs, good weekly and monthly scorecards, then we can begin to implement these rhythms, the weekly and monthly reviews, and then the quarterly, both setting what those key results are and objectives, and then also looking back and seeing what you've learned from a retrospective. We go on the next one, Joe. So, as I said before, we want to continue to balance empathy and results. So you can have great data, we can have some incredible scorecards, and we can even be populating them with great information. And yet at the same time, we've seen this happen and work with organizations that have these toxic cultures because they've become too focused on the results and too focused on the data. There's a distinction here that we like to call out, and it's the difference between being data-driven and data informed. So you don't want to let the data own too much of your behavior organizationally, yet you want it to be informing your key strategic decisions, your key day-to-day decisions. If you remember all the way back to the first couple slides of the deck and the opening session, we talked about how 5% of nonprofits are using key data to make day-to-day decisions. So we do want to get there where it's informing us, but we don't want to have it drive everything we do. We want to hold this balance of healthy behaviors and accountability, great data and healthy behaviors, so we don't become too focused on just being data-driven. And then we want to develop empathetic habits that prioritize a human-centered approach to data review. So you'll see this as we get through the slides and this presentation here. We want to continue to talk about client stories and client success stories before we jump into just looking at metrics. We want to keep the first thing first and stay focused on our mission. When we get into those quarterly reviews, that means pulling up your mission blueprint. It means from time to time, if you feel like any of us need to get back on track and be reminded of the foundation of the organization, you have those pieces there so you can do that. So that's bringing empathy into these data review habits and staying and prioritizing a human-centered approach. And related to this last point here, think of data as a flashlight, not a hammer. So I know we might feel like we're overemphasizing this a little bit, but it's just because we've seen the unintended consequences of becoming too data-driven in some nonprofits. And it might seem like that would be odd in a nonprofit, but it can happen just like it happens in a business. And so think instead of data as helping you discover key adjustments that need to be made, opening up big questions that could change the trajectory of a program or even your organization. So instead of rather seeing it as only an accountability tool, a hammer, think about it more as a flashlight, shining light on things that weren't previously known, opening up new understanding, allowing you to drive improvement, ultimately get closer and closer to those change the world targets and those desired outcomes on your mission blueprint. So with that, we're going to jump into what does a weekly level 10 leadership meeting look like. Rise Recovery knows this. Some others might know. Brooke is familiar with this. I did a training with Div Inc. and some of their cohort participants. Others of y'all might be familiar with this format. We're grateful for the fact that many people have read the book Traction, and in particular, this component of the Entrepreneur's Operating System has, pardon the pun, but gained a lot of traction among a lot of organizations, nonprofits and for-profit alike. The reason we're calling this weekly leadership meeting out here as part of this is the place where you will review your weekly scorecard every week. At the very least, it's a place where every week that you will not let a week go by without doing a quick check on those metrics. Now, as leaders, you may decide independently to spend a little bit more time in them, but this is the one time you come together. So I'm going to go over the whole meeting structure, and then we're going to just have a quick reflection on it and how it's different from maybe the current leadership meetings that you run currently. So the first thing we start with is this segue, and this is what we've done the first 2 days that we've been together. This can be this can happen in a variety of ways. You can do what we did, something you're looking forward to this weekend, or a personal best from the last couple weeks, or the summer or the beginning of the fall. You can share a client story. What's something that's impacted somebody that you're serving? You can also share stories of values lived out. I've done this with a lot of teams that I've led. Just say, hey, here are our values. This is a great way to help them become sticky in the culture, for people to hear actual examples of them, as opposed to just seeing them and understanding like how they are lived out. So a quick segue slash check in here. Again, you're bringing your whole self. You're kind of engaging in purpose and deeper meaning, getting to know each other, increasing empathy. That's why all these things really matter. And you're doing this because you're about to get into kind of a lot of left brain activities, looking at data. Is this on track? Is this off track? And if you don't bring in the other side, your right brain, then you run the risk of your whole self not being in the meeting. And so that's why we really encourage starting there. So from there, we're going to go to your weekly pulse scorecard review. So you've got those metrics. Imagine in the not too distant future, within the next 30 days or 60 days or so, you've got your great scorecard. You've got it populated with data, and you've got that 13 weeks of history. And you are quickly going to review it, and you're going to see if there's any questions, any discussions, any issues that arise. As an issue arises, if anyone sees something, someone can say, hey, I would love to talk about the last couple of weeks results for that certain metric. Whoever's running that meeting would drop it down to this, what says IDS, and which is basically just an issues area where you would record issues and then talk about them later. And you would leave them there to decide at that point of the meeting if it in fact is something the team needs to talk about. So you're looking for trends. If nothing else, you're just getting everybody on the same page with, here's where we are with the key metrics that matter to us. If there's anything to discuss, we're identifying what needs to be discussed. Then the next session, the OKR review, you've got your big priorities for a quarter, for a year, and you're just doing a quick, are we on track? Are we off track? Again, all we're really doing here is keeping it top of mind, so we don't go 7-8 weeks without looking at these. It's a way to make sure that as a team, you're staying focused on those, living in that 90-day world, and the priorities that really matter over the course of the quarter that you're in. And so you're ideally you're going, if whoever is the owner of one of these, you're saying, is it on track? Is it off track? If it's off track, similar to the scorecard exercise, you're saying, do we need to drop this down to the issues parking lot down there in IDS to discuss? And you're leaving it there to decide in just a few minutes. Headline. So this part of the meeting is just a way for you to go around the room and for everyone to share it. Not everyone has to share, but give everybody an opportunity to share if there's any quick updates. Think about this as level setting. Think about this as integration. I want to make sure if I'm running a key initiative or have a key update or something that's happened that might impact someone else in the organization or my department, that I'm sharing that out. Not discussion here. And this takes a lot of self-discipline to not get into big discussions at this point, but you're just sharing quick headlines, quick updates. Notice the 5 minutes off to the sides of all these, and you're probably thinking, wow, this is going to take a lot of discipline. You're right, it is. It does take time to master, but at this point through these 4, you're only about 20 minutes into the meeting. Then in the next one here, you're going in to review the to-dos that came out of the previous week. So every week when you're talking about your issues, when you're looking at your scorecard, if your OKRs are off track, you potentially are going to assign actions to get those things back on track, to resolve those issues. And then when you come together in the next week, you're going to be asking the people that had those actions to report out on how they did. And so everyone that has an action should be prepared to come to the meeting to give an update on how they did with their action items. And then the next thing here, this big block, the 60 minutes, IDS stands for identify, discuss, and solve. So as I said previously to this section, you've already been identifying some key potential issues in the scorecard. Is there a data trend that looks funny that we should talk about? Is there an OKR that's off track that we should talk about? Now, at this point, you're saying to the team, are there any other issues that we need to talk about this week? Anything that we have not yet identified? Anything that maybe did not carry over from last week? Any net new issues? And you might get to a point where you say, okay, we've got 8 issues on the list here. Then you're going to prioritize the top 3. And you're just going to focus on that meeting. You're only together for 90 minutes once a week. what are the most important issues in this 90 minutes we have together to focus on? If you get through those three, awesome, and you can move on to the next one, and you're rocking and rolling, that's great. Move on to the next ones. But if you only complete the three, that's okay because you completed the three most important. What typically happens for most teams that don't do this exercise is they just talk about the first thing that's on the list. And the risk here is when you do that, uh, that may not be the most important. It may be the eighth most important thing, and you miss talking about the most important stuff. So you've got to do that quick prioritization within that meeting, and you've got to. I'm sorry. There, thanks, Queen. And you have to determine which ones to talk about. So, and the other thing here is you're not just discussing, you're solving for these issues. So when that may look like complete resolution in the meeting, it may also just look like the solve for it is to say, hey, Jay and Jake, it looks like y'all have the most responsibility and passion about this particular topic. Can you finish resolving this offline and come back and present to us what the resolution was next week? That can also be a solve, but you're wrapping it up one way or another, either complete resolution or a clear action assigned out so that they know the next week to come back and report back on what their action was. The next thing you're going to do here is to wrap up the meeting is recap any of those to-dos that came up during the meeting. So you want to say, just go back over those actions and make sure everyone is clear on their assignments. And then lastly, if there's any cascading messages. So another typical failure, and that's a strong word, but it's just true, that happens in a lot of organizations. Great meetings, everything goes great. The people around the table have a responsibility to share with other people in the organization, and they just don't do it. And then people, it's not necessarily willfully, but they maybe just they're busy, they forget. So we want to say around the table, what are the messages that we want to share out with the rest of the organization, the rest of our team, whatever stakeholder group, whoever it is. You want to be intentional in saying, here's what and how we're going to share this out based on the decisions and key updates that came up as part of this meeting. So before I open it up, just to get a little bit of reflection, I know I'm talking really fast here, but it's because this this particular piece here could be a half-day session, and we've done full sessions just on running an incredible leadership meeting. But we felt we'd be remiss if we didn't give you the whole context with where the scorecard, the weekly scorecard review fits in to your regular rhythms and cadences. One thing I want to share before we open it up is that mastering this meeting has such an impact on organizations. It's amazing how many organizations that we work with that we see, if they just do this right, how much more efficient they become, how much better they feel about their ability to focus on the things that matter most, and how much more informed they feel when they're looking at the right set of data and when they're focusing on the priorities that matter most for the quarter. So with that said, I'd love just a few minutes, open it up to the big group. How does this, is this different than how your weekly meetings currently run? And if so, how? You'll get like 2 or 3 responses here.
I'll share a little bit for ours. We definitely don't have it down to these timelines, but Monica has done an amazing job setting up and leading. We have a weekly staff meeting. We're a small company, so there's not that many of us, but it's not something that is in a place where it can scale once as we grow. So this is something that's really excited for us to implement once I heard it from Sean and now with Monica here. But we do, Monica leads us through a great segue and it changes every week, and that's been really helpful. And then I think the thing, obviously the big takeaways for us is kind of like, sometimes we just end up spending too much time. We dig into that thing right then and there because it's our only time that we're all together. And, we just end up going way too long and not getting to everything. So that's where we are.
Yeah, great reflection, Brooke. I think that's probably the thing that I hear from our clients more than anything else is like when something comes up, they just tend to continue to talk and talk about it. And the cost here is that when you do that, there's potentially more important things that you're not talking about. I know you know that from talking about this, but just for everyone else here, that's why that prioritization and pushing things down until you have a chance to say, like, what's the most important things that we talk about together is so critical. How about anyone else? Any other reflections on how this is different than your current weekly leadership meetings or department meetings? I know Rise is running on these, so they probably don't have a ton to say. And how about Austin Stone? Anybody? How does this compare to your current structure?
John had to depart, so current structure would look similar to a degree. Some of the expressions of what's encapsulated in the meeting function, we digitize using a tool called 15.5. So really what it allows you to do is take online and in written form a lot of the review of action items and OKR kind of pieces. So it really enables you to discuss and connect in your meeting settings and eliminate some of this. So that'd be at least a way in which we have iterated upon a structure similar.
Thank you.
I was wondering if Rise is already doing this, like what's their feeling on it, or how has it been? What was the change?
Great question, Brooke.
Like I said, when we first started using it, it was very hard to stay within this 5 minutes. And the difficult part is when we talk about reviewing last week and even the rock review, we try to all start digging in and solving problems. And so, yes, the hardest part, because it's an excellent way, and the steps in the order they are just so profound and smart. When you actually follow it. But no, it is not easy to do. And at the end of every meeting, we rate ourselves. Each person gives an individual rating for that week, just how they think the meeting went. We probably do run the 90 minutes to 2 hours for this to go on, but no, I can't say enough good about it. What we did we have it in Google, no, in our Trello, on our Trello board. It's set up there and we can all access it there. And so on the very first column, Sean helped us remember we have the list of what we're supposed to do in the first column. So it's good to, go back and say, oh, this is Segway, this is Scorecard. Even after all these months of doing it, it's a good reminder for us to know, to kind of keep us in check and talk about things in the order they're supposed to be discussed.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Kim. All right, I think I'm going to move us on. Joe, if you want to stop sharing, I think I got mine working now. Awesome. Okay, can y'all see my screen okay? Great. All right, so I'm going to zoom into that weekly data pulse review as part of the context of that overall L10 and what we're really trying to achieve here. So a quick understanding of the day-to-day operation. So when you're looking at that data, you're getting a sense of how are things going. One of the litmus tests for this is like if you had no other access to any other information, if you were some of the examples from even just a year ago don't apply anymore because we're all in a remote world, but imagine this is the only piece of information you can have. Would it give you a sense for how things are going? Or would you be wanting to know about some other key metrics? It's a good way to think about when you're forming that weekly pulse. And then again, as we taught on earlier, is it information that just feels right and for you to lead the day-to-day, for you to understand like what matters week to week? Is it meaningful in a weekly cadence? It also allows you to head off problems early, kind of that early warning system. And then lastly, what we've been talking about throughout, it begins to build that muscle memory if you're making decisions informed by data. So you're looking at it, and we're about to practice it with this, but you're starting to look at it, the historical trends, looking at the metrics that matter most, and you're getting used to making decisions informed by data. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few minutes here. And we're going to stay together in the big group. And I want you to look at this example of a weekly pulse report. We've got the history over here. We've got a target. This is practice at what you would do when you get together weekly as a team and review your weekly pulse report, your weekly scorecard. So I'm going to pause for a minute or two. Just take a few notes on what stands out. What would you want to talk about? If this were your organization, what would you highlight and say, that's interesting. I want to talk about that. Take about a minute or two here. Okay, anything standing out to anybody?
The client served for me in March, like March the 1st and 8th.
Okay, great.
It was like a big decline. So,
Yeah. So you'd want to know more about what that's about?
correct.
Okay, great. What else?
Yeah, I would say similarly with the number of housing placements, just noting the trend and declines over the last several weeks.
Great. Okay, that's a good one.
I was noticing the program exits with the goal being over 25 a week. It seems like that goal hasn't been even closely reached. So I don't know if the goal is unrealistic or if something needs to be changed there.
Great. That's a great one. Others? One or two more?
Oh wait, did I read that wrong? Is it less than?
No, you're.
Was it more than? Because it might be right on if it's less than.
Yeah, you're still on track though.
Oh, okay.
I'll add one. They're very whole and round numbers for meals served, and they become actually accurate numbers starting on February 2nd. So I would wonder, hey, what changed there?
Maybe a data issue, you're saying, Todd? Or
anytime there's a pattern of round numbers, it means somebody's fibbing somewhere.
Right. Good. Okay, any one more maybe? All right, I'm going to move us to the next slide here. So these are not limited to the potential findings of what you might want to talk about on this scorecard, but just wanted to highlight a few. Y'all caught most of them, which is great. And just also to call a couple of warnings out that we've talked about before. So let's start with this first one, a client served. Yes, there's this big jump here. And there's a couple of things to note here. One, if you remember earlier, we talked about not overreacting to a certain, to a singular data point. And yet the reason I would want to look at this one is that is a huge shift. The reality is that, you know, some of y'all are going to know your operation so much that you're going to be able to look at a number like this and immediately know whether it's even real. Sometimes this can be as much about bad data as it can be about a significant actual shift in operations and what's going on. And so the question, that's one of the first questions, like, is this real? If it is real, and again, you probably, back to our training in this 5 minute, what you're looking to do is define the questions, assign the actions, and be ready to come back with what's going on. So the questions that I would ask out of this is like, is this real data? If it is real, what occurred during this week that this happened? Now, there are so many things that this could be true for. So I've worked at organizations where we had huge surges from natural disasters, and this number could be real. But what's interesting, now everybody's probably going to know that if that happened. But sometimes what doesn't happen is if you look back when you get into the monthly format, and you might say, well, how did we do this month last year? Sometimes people forget that, oh yeah, that month last year, we had that huge surge of extra clients for this particular reason. So a lot of things we want to get, a lot of great questions here, but we want to zero in on what's actually going on here and what adjustments do we need to make based on what's going on here. So that's the first one. The second one here is there's definitely a trend and kind of looking like more real data, as Todd pointed out, but there's also an upward trend. And there's a trend here that is over 5 weeks. Now it drops all of a sudden, but I don't want to know like what happened. Like why were we serving more meals here? What was this about? Hopefully people around the table, when you're asking these questions, there's someone around the table that can answer that question. But if they can't answer that question, then it's an opportunity to go investigate a little bit deeper and to see what's going on. Moving on to the next one here. Yeah, Monica, you picked up on this one. The program exits are, they're meant to be below 25, and yet they're significantly below 25. And so my question might be like, maybe this isn't the right mark. Maybe we should be challenging ourselves a little bit more to say, what we really want to do is keep these under 8 or maybe even 5. It depends on how clients move in and out of the program for what the appropriate goal is and how that relates to intakes, obviously. But in particular, what happened over these 3 weeks that we had so few exits? And if we're looking at them in a correlating period of time when intakes are happening, what does that mean to our capacity, right? So that you're looking at these things related to each other, you're looking at them in the historical trend of it, and you're trying to say what shifts, what adjustments do we need to make it. Remember, at this point, we're at a weekly cadence. This is largely meant to help make adjustments and shifts for your day-to-day operations. And as you get used to looking at these metrics, you start to say, I'm gonna be concerned about our capacity if I'm seeing intake stay steady and I'm seeing our program exits stay low. And what does that mean from a resourcing perspective? If you're like a residential facility, like you might be running out of physical space. And what does that mean? And are you watching that metric closely? That might, another question might say like, well, maybe we should be reviewing our capacity as part of this weekly report. And maybe we didn't previously identify that. And then the last one here is just on this newsletter sign up. And notice we put a few, even though we focused on the programmatic, we put a few more, kind of think of these as development, marketing, and operation, financial down here. And just notice here that the newsletter signups were there was a lower trend here. And so the question would be like, what did we do different starting in January 26th? And this could be a good thing. Oh yeah, remember we had that discussion where we weren't doing so well, and we did this thing that led to a sustained improvement on the newsletter signups. So just good to look at that and understand it. In this case, what the hope is that the team already addressed it, and that's why the improvement's there. So great job recognizing some of those. We're going to move on to the monthly metric review purpose. So the monthly metric review meeting really creates an opportunity for leaders to examine kind of longer trends. So if you remember back to that template we showed earlier today, you can look at the kind of the current fiscal year, rolling 12 months, longer periods of time, and you're looking at data captured over the period of a month. So you just have a bigger data set you're looking at. These big questions should generate big discussions. And ultimately, if you remember, we're talking about making thoughtful adjustments here. So those big questions and discussions could lead to micro adjustments. They could lead to macro adjustments, meaning that sometimes you're discovering something so big and looking at your monthly scorecard that it's potentially causing a shift in your blueprint. That's not often. It's more likely going to cause shifts in how you think about setting your quarterly and annual priorities. But every once in a while, you're going to find the discussion that's so big that it says, maybe there's a new outcome we should be tracking. Maybe there's a different focus on the short term or potentially long term that really is a core part of our theory of impact that we hadn't previously claimed. So put a stake in the ground on. So you're looking for these type of big questions, big discussions that will lead to those adjustments and learning, and which will continue to shape the way that you provide focus and direction for your organization. And these adjustments made should drive performance improvement and progress towards accomplishing those long-term targets. So the shifts and the adjustments are for the purpose of getting closer and closer to achieving those long-term goals and evidence of those core outcome performance. So again, just a reminder there that you're more likely to see this in a monthly metric review than you are in kind of the set of metrics that we just showed on the previous screen. A little bit of prep here. We're not going to hit this too hard. Note that there is some materials in your appendix that go into more detail on how to prepare for these meetings, and this is stuff that will be available to coach on as y'all get ready to implement these. But just one of the things that we want to hit quickly here is that it's important for the top leadership team in your organization to set aside 90 minutes every month to review the most important metrics. Ideally, you have a diverse set of leaders that represents the holistic nature of the organization. So someone from operations, development, finance, CEO, COO, admin, et cetera. If you're a smaller organization, that might just mean like all 4 or 5 of you or 2 or 3 of you are meeting together and doing this, and that's fine. You know, as you grow, just think about the different hats around the table that you need to have there. And you want to distribute this report at least a couple of days before the meeting, giving people an opportunity to review the metrics and prepare questions. Unlike the weekly, where you're looking at it every week, you're only doing this once a month, so it's important to give people a little bit of time to prepare what those questions might be. And then everyone that's attending these meetings should spend about 15 minutes reviewing that key data, preparing any questions they might have for the meeting. So I'm going to go through this much more quickly. And again, you have these in your participant guide. A lot of similarities to what you would see in the format for the weekly. A few key distinctions. The first one, and this is a really important one, this is that whole balance of the qualitative and the quantitative. We suggest you start with a client story. So before you jump right into the data, start with a story. I'm always reminded when I talk about this, the organization that I used to work at in San Antonio, Haven for Hope, was founded largely because of a vision of a Presbyterian pastor in San Antonio named Louis Zabinden. He actually recently, unfortunately, just passed away. But he led a downtown Presbyterian church. And about 35 years ago, he was walking into his office, as he does every day, and he passed a homeless man on the street who asked for help. And he paused and talked to him, and he listened to his story, and he was present with him. And he invited him in for some cold water, and I think they gave him a sandwich, but then the man returned to the streets. Well, the next day the man died. And it created this movement in San Antonio because of how moved this pastor was. He was so ashamed of how terrible a job that the local faith community had done in taking care of people experiencing homelessness, that he rallied a movement around it. He then went on 25 years later, when Haven for Hope was founded, to be a board member. And he was like the soul of our board. And I loved him because I was responsible for bringing the data to the meeting. And he would pause every single board meeting after I would present the key metrics to the board. And he would say, let's be reminded, every single data point represents a human story. It's an individual. He would pause every time and he'd look at, I'm talking about the 2 biggest philanthropists in the state of Texas, very powerful men. He would make them pause and say, we're going to remember that there are human stories behind every single data point here. So we start there to remember what's most important. So always tell a story. So tell a story of a client that's successfully moving through your program. Tell a story of a client who maybe did not successfully move through your program. What were the issues and hurdles that they faced? Just connect the stories to the actual data points here. Take 5 minutes to do that. Assign someone to bring that story to the meeting so it's ready and you're prepared to do that. Then you want to celebrate the wins. It's interesting. I love that Joe brought up the Tiger Woods agenda. I think I am guilty of being probably like too much like Tiger Woods, I would say, and I don't do a very good job of stopping and saying, I did it, we did it. there's just there's a real healthiness to pausing and saying we actually accomplished the goal. So I'd say it's sort of like the balance. Being driven is good, right? But if you're too driven and we don't pause and we don't say like, what are the wins that we've been achieving? We've been working so hard. We've been reviewing this data. What can we stop and pause as a team and say that is a really incredible result? So as you're reflecting on this ahead of this meeting, look for those things. Look for the wins to bring to the meeting to say, wow, it's COVID. I think for I'll just share one as a team for us. Like we had a profitable quarter last quarter after just crazy adjustments from the first quarter of being impacted by COVID, like so many were. And we just paused and said, man, that is amazing. Based on where we were from March to June, from July to September, to think that we would get back to profitability 1 quarter removed from COVID, like we need to pause and celebrate that. And we did, even if it's just briefly, is to say, hey, this is something incredible to be aware of. What are those moments for your organization? Pause and claim them. Build in that culture of like you cross the finish line. Otherwise, the finish line is just always elusive, and you just get exhausted. That you're running 20 marathons, instead of just one. So we want to be able to say, what are those markers, and did we do it? Review last month's actions, some that were assigned out. And then this next one here, harvest all of the questions. So the questions that come out that need to be talked about, just like y'all did. Y'all just identified there are 4 or 5 things we want to talk about. If I were facilitating that meeting, I would have prioritized them and then led us through a discussion and doing that, prioritizing them. And we would go to an IDS, just like we talked about, similarly, and working through the questions and issues that arose from the data when we reviewed it. And then we're going to review the actions and create that communication plan out, very similar to what we talked about in the L10. Okay, same thing. We're going to take a few minutes. We are going to look at this one, and I want y'all to see about 1 to 2 minutes. What stands out? If this were your organization, what would you want to talk about as a team? All right, what stands out? Does anything stand out? Anybody? This is practice, so don't worry about how wrong or right you might be here. We're just practicing reviewing data and talking about it.
I would be alarmed that the number of job placements was half this month as it was the same time last year this month.
Yep.
And also I guess we don't really know how far in the fiscal year we are, because I looked down at the positive press stories and we've done 4 this month, but a total of 9 for the whole fiscal year, current fiscal year. So.
Yeah, great question. First one's great. Second one, great too. Let's just, for the sake of being on the same page, let's say we're about 3 months into the fiscal year. Anything else stand out?
So, like Kim, I noticed the same thing, that the number of job placements was lower, but then also it seems like overall retention is better. So that would make me wonder kind of what's changed. Has there been like policy changes or more focus on those specific types of job placements? And so it's resulting in, higher job retention.
Great. That's huge. You're correlating metrics. You're asking if a shift in one causes a change in the other. That's awesome. Any other reflections?
The employee turnover rate seemed to rise within that year around that time. So that increased maybe by 8% more.
Okay, that's good. And one more.
I find it interesting. I'm sorry, was somebody else going?
Go ahead, Liz.
Oh, I find it interesting that job retention went up, but the housing retention went down.
Okay. Great.
And Sean, the piece that I was going to add here too is there's been some great pieces that folks are pulling out. I think what's great to see as well is when organizations start to connect some of these changes year over year to what that might mean for their core outcomes and what might happen, if they don't respond to this data. We're now at a monthly basis, so we're looking at this data. We see a change year over year. What might this mean about what we're on track to do in terms of our core outcomes or our OKRs as well? So for any of these that connect to one of your OKRs could be a bit of insight into how you're progressing towards those and what you might need to do to adjust.
That's great. Excellent. So y'all picked up on some key ones and more, which is great. We're not going to hit all of them. I'm going to hit a few here. Deanna, you picked up on a key one. This is sort of picking up on the story that I shared on the unintended consequences and therefore the shifts that this organization made. And what you see here is essentially, if you look back to this month last year, they were running at a higher clip of job placements, but they were running at worse retention rates, right? And so part of the story that you might look at here and say is, well, maybe they went to quality over quantity. And they're in fact placing less people in jobs, but in the current fiscal year so far, they're beginning to see much better retention rates as a result of their ability to focus on that. Now, we don't know what the exact intervention was that they did just on this data, but if we were part of this organization, the assumption would be that they've made some key programmatic shifts and changes. And again, to what Joe just shared, in the spirit of, is it getting us closer to the ultimate outcomes that we care about? As opposed to being focused on maybe something that feels like it should matter because perhaps a key funder is telling us it does, but maybe it ultimately doesn't, to how as much as a couple other measures that we think really matter as part of our theory of impact, those long-term outcomes and those change the world targets. So great insight there. Y'all mentioned some other really good ones. I think one thing I'd share is something like employee turnover rate. I put this here just to tease it out as a question. Oftentimes things like this can be not that meaningful in a singular month, but start to be a lot more meaningful when you start to accumulate months together. If you're an organization of 50 people and 4 people or 3 people happen to leave in 1 month, that's going to cause a significant spike. But if you go 3 or 4 months with nobody leaving, it's much more meaningful to look at the average of that information. You also want to ask, like, what happened that month, but to start to look at these over a little bit longer periods of time becomes more meaningful. And then just we'll shift here, if you were looking at employee engagement, what caused this increase here? What's causing this increase in the current fiscal year, especially compared to the previous year? And the last thing just to highlight here is, I put this one here because I'm not sure this is a good metric to put in the monthly metric review. And it's a good example of what we think will be meaningful. And then we start to look at it and like, well, hey, look, if we're between 7 and 8%, like all the time, like, what are we really doing with this information? You might want to look at it. You do want to monitor overhead as part of it being a nonprofit, but maybe you just need to look at it quarterly, annually. Maybe it's just a financial metric that your controller or CFO or someone keeps an eye on. If there's an issue, they alert someone. But it may not change enough to be meaningful to look at in this type of setting. So great, y'all picked up on some awesome trends and discussions there. Again, just the closing here is you're calling out what needs to be talked about so you can make those key adjustments. Okay, I'm going to move pretty quickly through the quarterly key results. review. And this is, we're going to come back and hit on this in a little bit more detail after we get through our November meeting. So I'll just hit on it briefly here. But just like we've got a weekly and a monthly format to review key information, we've got a quarterly format to do that too. So as you set those objectives and key results, and you have key results that are defined to a quarter, we want to get in a rhythm of setting them and then reviewing them and looking at progress towards them quarter by quarter and even month by month. So this is meant to drive a culture of accountability, improvement, and learning. And it's also meant to improve the quality of those key results that you set. So based on how you do in the first bunch that you created, you're going to say, well, gosh, we only completed half of them. What improvements could we make to get more accurate and more just better at setting those KRs in the future? And then it also builds great team chemistry, understanding who was responsible for certain things. How did they do? Like, how do you hone in together based on bringing the different areas of the organization you're responsible for to set better and better KRs? So very similar to the other structures here. I think the key thing that I want to call out is distinguishing a little bit distinctive than the other ones. During these quarterly reviews, we really love to borrow from the agile concept of sprints and a retrospective. And in a retrospective, what you do here is 3 simple questions. What went well? Spend some time looking at that. What could have gone better? I'm in this middle section here. Open conversation. You're time boxing it. You're going 20 minutes. And then ID 2 to 3 things that we're going to do better. And this is not limited to just the results and the scores of those results. This is also about how do you do working together as a team, and what things can we do better relationally, how we trust each other, how we assign work, how we come back and get our work done, all those things. And then as a result, also, how do we get better at setting those KRs? And then you set the next quarter's key results, and you create a communication plan. So here's what we've set, here are the priorities. How are we going to share this with the rest of our department or organization, whoever else needs to know? So again, just a quick touch on this. We're going to come back to this after we get through our November period, and our first priority is getting you all feeling really good about your mission blueprint and your couple of scorecards, and then we'll come back to this one. Just another reminder, I mentioned this before, but your L10 meeting guide and prep and an overall agenda along with your monthly and quarterly agenda, that is all in the appendix of your participant guide. So if you have any questions about the details for what's the agenda, how do we prepare for those meetings, all that content is there in your participant guide. And of course, we're available for any questions you have. Ultimately, this is the bottom line here. We talked about this concept of what gets measured gets done. We like to think about it a little bit differently. Not only that, but what gets measured, discussed, and adjusted gets dramatically better. So we get better and better when we're measuring, discussing, and making those thoughtful adjustments. So that's what we want you to hear. This practice of these rhythms, these healthy reviews, that's what this is all about. Those thoughtful adjustments that get you closer and closer to those change the world targets and those desired long-term and short-term outcomes.